We're going to take a quick look at the overall kind of architecture of Alfresco and sort of the ecosystem technology around that. We're going to take a look at developing extensions or customizations for Alfresco 1 on-prem. And we're going to take a look at the public REST API, how you can use that, and how you can actually add to it. So how many here have been developing with Alfresco for a while? Okay, great. And how many are brand new to Alfresco? Okay, excellent. So hopefully some of this may be repetition for those familiar with Alfresco, but hopefully it won't be too boring for you. We're going to keep things at a pretty high level in this talk. This is getting started. So I'm not going to dive too deep into any of the details. There are lots of sessions for the specifics of that and getting into the advanced details of some of those implementations. In particular, around share, there are several great talks on customization of share. That's one of the more popular ones. So I encourage you to check those out. Anywhere you see underlined here is a link. If you go to the slides, you could get straight to that session page. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about XML configuration, a lot of the database side of things. So again, going to keep things at a fairly high level just to give you an overview. And unfortunately, my slides are advancing by themselves. So this is kind of an overall picture of the system of technologies that can go into making up an Alfresco deployment and some of the things that are possible. At the heart of this, we've got the core Alfresco repository that is sort of the hub of our content, our metadata. We can expose that content through file system emulations and server volume emulations, things like FTP, CIFS, WebDAV. We've got obviously different protocols that we can talk to Alfresco. Over on the right here, we see the APIs around CMIS. We've got the WebScript APIs, the public API, apologies. We've got portal integration. We have SharePoint emulation. We have different pluggable content stores, different means of clustering databases. We can have, back to the content stores, replicating content stores. We can have things like S3 content stores. We can synchronize this stuff with cloud and have this hybrid environment. So there's a whole lot involved here. There's a lot of things to consider when you start to do your development. And you don't need to know all of it in detail, but you should understand at a high level a lot of these concepts. Because you don't want to go reinventing the wheel. There's a chance that a piece of your implementation, or maybe even the whole thing, already exists in some form or another. So again, understanding the basic concepts behind a lot of these moving parts is critical. And another thing to point out with this architecture is that some of these things change. Some of the protocols or recommended extension points can change. So quite often you'll be going down the development path, you'll do a search, you'll find a blog post by somebody that is prevalent in the industry, in particular Alfresco development community kind of thing. But maybe that's a 2-year-old blog post, and the recommendations may have changed since then. So once you find that post, and once you grab onto the terms that are being used to describe that problem and solution, I encourage you to go check out the official documentation. Make sure that's still the recommended extension point, because people are all very busy, don't always have time to go back and update blog posts with the latest way to do some sort of extension or customization. And again, there's a lot of stuff to cover here. So if you have the means, you may want to consider things like our consulting services or engaging a partner, because they're obviously familiar with this entire ecosystem and know most of it in depth and can really help you with the right direction before you go down a wrong path of development and have to backtrack and refactor a lot of things. So those familiar with Alfresco, this will be the most boring slide, I promise. The others are a little more interesting. We've got the concept of nodes. That essentially ends up being documents for most people. We refer to those through node refs. It's essentially an identifier for that. Those nodes have properties, and the binaries are stored in content stores. And again, we can have replicating content stores, caching content stores, S3 content stores. Usually they're going to end up as a file system, essentially, is where the content's going to be stored. But that's an abstract content store that's pluggable and can fit a variety of different deployments. So before we actually start our development, we're probably going to have some needs around configuration of a system. We need to stand something up that we can play with. And that's done through these global properties that are applicable across the repository. That includes things like database credentials, ports that certain services will listen on or try to contact others, limits around things like content transformers, and those limits include like timeouts or size-based limits, the paths to binary executables for things like content transformations or sometimes metadata extraction. There are kind of three ways that you can get to these properties. There's the Alfresco global properties, but that's actually aggregated from several different spots. So we've got on the root of the class path our Alfresco global properties, but you can also stick in these same kind of properties into modules. There's several places that are designated to pull from the class path on Bootstrap for reading these properties. We can change a lot of them through GMX as well, so you can fire up a JConsole and change those properties. And in 4.2, we have this fantastic admin console where you can go in and through a nice user interface configure a lot of these properties without having to edit properties files or develop a module. You can just do it right in the interface. And I should note that this is an enterprise-only feature, but it's very easy to use. Really speeds up administration of a server. So getting back to our development now, we've covered how we can stand up one of these servers. It's important to think about what it is you're trying to develop, the architecture of your solution. And there's kind of two paths there. Are you extending Alfresco and an on-prem installation or customizing it in some way? Or are you just developing, not just, there's some very nice apps out there. Are you developing an app that talks to Alfresco? And you don't necessarily need customizations on the on-prem side of what you're talking to. So the way that we want to go forward with extending the on-prem installation are AMPs, which we'll get into in a second. And if we're talking to Alfresco with an external application, we're going to use this public REST API, which we'll also get into. Boy, these slides are annoying me. I'm sorry. So an AMP is an Alfresco module package. It's essentially a zip file with a specific structure. And it's a way that you can package up the classes that are needed, the Java classes in a jar, any config that's needed, the web resources for user interface side of things. And these modules, these AMPs, can be versioned. So your particular module can have its own version that's independent of the Alfresco version, the repository that it's going to go against. But you can specify the version that's required of the Alfresco repository for your module. You can have a minimum and a maximum of what's going to be supported when you install this. You can declare module dependencies. Maybe your module depends on some other module. And it's important to note that that's not currently enforced at the moment, but it will be in the future. And these are managed by this module management tool, which is responsible for doing installation of modules, backing up of older existing modules, enforcing the Alfresco version requirements, those sorts of things. And that's actually a Java-based tool that's wrapped in a jar for delivery and ease of use. All the dependencies are wrapped up in a single jar so that you can execute via command line. I want to install this AMP into this war or this exploded war. Or I want to install this directory of AMPs into this war or exploded war. And these AMPs can work against the repository side or share wars or exploded directories. So again, this enables just about any kind of customization you would ever require for a repository or share side of things. You can customize data model. You can get in and override and customize individual services related to the content, file folder service. Any of those extension points are available through these amps. And one reason to consider these amps is that it does encourage a repeatable build process in your development environment, and it's going to be more likely to be upgrade safe. I'm sure all of us have had the experience of, well, I'll just get in there and edit this file real quickly and it'll be fine. And 2 years later, do any of us remember that we edited that file, we go for an upgrade, all of a sudden that customization is wiped out. So when we've got it as a separate module, that stuff is going to be more cleanly maintained. It's a cleaner extension point. And we can see some of this stuff in the admin console, kind of what modules are available and installed. So, all right, we've decided to do amps for our on-prem customization. How do we actually get started with that? Alfresco Maven SDK is a great means of getting that first start. It's got Maven archetypes in there. Who here is familiar with Maven already? Fantastic. So Maven archetypes, for those of you who don't know, are essentially a quick means of getting the structure of a project going, and also gives you the, in the case of the Maven SDK, can define a parent POM that gives you profiles and gives you a lot of the configuration and dependencies that you're probably going to need in your AMP anyway. And then that also includes a Alfresco Maven plugin, which helps with packaging of the AMP, deploying the AMP, running the AMP against Ward and Jetty server, and there's lots of things that you can do with this Alfresco Maven plugin around AMPs. It makes it very convenient. So there's a link here to the official documentation on the Alfresco Maven plugin and SDK. And then there's a session by Gab that actually doesn't even have Maven in the title. It's very long, couldn't even fit it on here. But it's enabling something, 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 the development of something, something, Alfresco apps. It's a great presentation. I saw, got to see it in Barcelona. I encourage you to check that out if you're doing any kind of customizations and interested in Maven in particular. So the other thing that we get with Maven is the Alfresco repository for Maven artifacts. And each of the artifacts, let's take a Alfresco repository for example, is deployed with not only the jar that's needed there, but it's got the source files. It's got JavaDoc artifacts. It's got test artifacts, config artifacts, and we can thank Samuel Langlois. I think he's in here somewhere. There he is. He's been the driver of all this, and if you haven't used these kind of tools in your development environment, they become incredibly useful because you don't have to download the source separately. You can be sitting in your IDE, something like Eclipse, and you're developing your AMP and you don't understand what some method signature for content service is. Well, you just hover over it and it's going to give you the Java docs and describe that, exactly what's in the documentation for that. You open declaration and it's going to download the source for you and take you right to that class so you can see it immediately. So this is incredibly helpful for your development environment. And I've been doing this stuff a while. I was actually a community contributor and developer since, I think since 2005 actually. And I remember the days of downloading this gigantic SDK and then unzipping the sources and trying to find the particular class I was looking for. It wasn't much fun. This is just a lot better way to go. And it's just seamless. Well, obviously, with the caveat that you all know that are familiar with Maven, you have to download the internet first. But once that's done, it's fantastic. Hey, that one actually advanced right on time. So when we actually get into the code that we're developing for our amps or on-prem config, there are a lot of ways that we can go about these kind of customization or extension points, and that's really going to depend on the solution that you're trying to develop. We've obviously got things like web scripts that can be driven by server-side JavaScript, by Java, Groovy. We can hook into CMIS at points. We can use, obviously, the REST API that we're going to talk more about. We've got IMAP and FTP emulation. So there are a lot of different choices out there that you can use to build out your solution. And it takes some thought. It takes some some time to, again, understand that high-level architecture and evaluate these different choices and figure out what's going to be best for your solution. So some things that are new in 4.2 for developers. I'm not, again, going to go into much detail on any of these, but there's things around hybrid workflow, easier clustering setup. We've got this Alfresco public API annotation that's going to designate that certain methods are set in stone. We've got things around content transformer configuration and setup that makes life a little easier to try to determine what's going to be used for what kind of content transformation. And then we've got the database transactional queries, which just mentioned briefly here, but essentially the eventual consistency of Solr, the goal with these is to get rid of that. So if you have needs for particular in-transaction queries, definitely check out Andy Hines' talk on this if you're interested in it. He goes into, obviously, a lot more depth than this. So back to our architecture that we're talking about. We had those two different choices. We've got our on-prem, or we're developing apps that talk to Alfresco, some form of Alfresco. That could be cloud, that could be on-prem. So if we look at that, we've got the Alfresco API that encompasses CMIS and then our public REST API. Who here is already familiar with CMIS? Content Management Interoperability Services? Okay. For those of you that don't know, that essentially handles everything around content. So folders and files and metadata and ACLs. It's the means by which repositories can communicate with each other on familiar protocols and over familiar models and schemas. And then the REST API is essentially for everything that's not covered by the CMIS specification. Things like sites, people, tagging, commenting, favorites, none of those are in the CMIS spec. So that sits alongside CMIS on a public REST API. And this was deployed to cloud first, and it's now in 4.2 on-prem. And CMIS 1.1 also has a browser binding, JSON binding. So we've got common response format for both sides of this API. So if you're interested more in CMIS, there are a couple of great sessions here, getting started with CMIS and what's coming in CMIS 1.1. There's obviously the book, CMIS and Apache Chemistry in Action, fantastic. And then there's a link to the actual chemistry project itself, too. A great way to start investigating CMIS is the CMIS workbench, which you can find at this link, the chemistry project link. And that is essentially a generic browser of CMIS repositories. So you can hook that up to your Alfresco deployment and just navigate around and see what kind of properties are returned, see how the structure of CMIS works. Great way to get started. So we've obviously got consistency in this API. That's a major concern for its development. We obviously have a structure to the URLs, the HTTP methods. We're focused on common error handling and returning proper HTTP response codes for different actions. Obviously, there's consistency in the querying and the pagination, the filtering, and the order clauses. And this is the same across all of Alfresco 1, so cloud and on-prem 4.2. So if we look at what some of these URLs look like, the first instance we can see highlighted that we've got CMIS and in the API. The second one we're calling the public Alfresco API endpoint that we can see versioned there. And just another example of how it looks in cloud versus on-prem. And there we've got a network ID. We're using the special default one in the case up here. We've got the namespace, which in this case is Alfresco, and the entity that we're dealing with. So here we're dealing with sites. So a network ID might be something like your company. The namespace can be things like Alfresco, workflow. That's sort of the parent root API that you're dealing with. And then, of course, we mentioned the types of things that we can do with the REST side of the API, people, tags, workflows, sites, obviously. So if we take that a little bit deeper, we've got the relationships that we can start to manage there. We still see that API namespace, of course, Alfresco. We've got the entity sites that we're dealing with, and now we start to get into relationships of that entity that we're dealing with, so the members of a site. So here's just a sampling of some of the endpoints, some of the entities that you can manipulate using the public API. But for the full reference, there's a link in the slides here for the API reference documentation. Then there's also a nice getting started that kind of goes through how you can start to play with this API and how you sign up for a cloud account, for example. So we'll take a look at a demo that Gethin has recorded. And here we're essentially highlighting the consistency across cloud and on-prem, looking at a JSON-based responses there, and checking out how easy it is to use some of this stuff. Move this over for you guys. You guys see that okay? So right now we're just starting up, I believe, an on-prem repo. So here, this is Postman, if you're not familiar with it. It's essentially just a REST client tool. And cloud is using OAuth, so we are granting authorization for a particular client credentials for a particular account. We're essentially obtaining that all-important OAuth token. We can see here, well, some of us can see here, that the URL that we're pointing to is cloud, in this case api.alfresco.com. And here we're just copying in that bearer token, the OAuth token that we've obtained through that authorization. So we're going to send a URL. If you can't see the URL there, we're going to people me. We're essentially looking at a activity feed. We're grabbing a particular person in this case with a special tag of me. And we can see here the response in JSON format that's showing the details for that person. Take a look at another saved query. We're digging a little bit deeper into that people me endpoint, and we're looking for the activities feed. And we had some filters on there that said that the maximum number we wanted to return of 50. And we're going to filter for that same person. So Gethin hasn't been very busy on the cloud side of things. He doesn't have too many activities in there. Now we're going to remove the filter of the person that we're looking for within this activity feed. So we're going to see everything that Gethin follows, essentially the sites or people. So this is the full activity feed response in JSON. I hope you all are taking notes. There's going to be a quiz later. Who was the third entry? So we can see the count did obey our max of 50. There's certainly a lot more. Because Gethin likes to follow a lot of things. And we could certainly remove that. And we can also do pagination through those same URL parameters. So I believe now we're going to switch to on-prem to show the similarities between those two. And on-prem, we're using basic auth instead of OAuth there. That may vary in your deployment environment, of course. And I think I want to fast forward a bit here. Okay. I mean, I know we all like to watch things start up, but skip ahead a bit. So I think he's using here the Maven SDK to essentially fire up this local repository, because again, we're going to on-prem, and the URL we saw was going to hit localhost. If you saw saw at the end there. That was running a Jetty server. So we're going to take a look at that same URL, but we've got a different base URL localhost. Again, instead of api.alfresco.com in the cloud. So not too many activities on this side of things on the on-prem installation. It seems to be a pretty much out of the box where we've got the sample content in there. But taking a look at our favorites, we've got a particular item favorited currently, was the call we just made. I'm going to grab the ID from that, and we'll do a get on that just to verify the details and take a look at the response given. So what is this item that we favorited? Show me this favorite. And now we're going to issue a delete, different HTTP method rather than get. We're going to do a delete to remove that favorite. And we can see here we got a 204 response code, which means this operation completed, but there's nothing to see here. Let's move along. So we're going to grab that same ID, and you can see we're posting a JSON body when we make this call, and we're doing a post HTTP method. And we can see here we've got a 201 created response, which means this was also successful. And I've created something, and that creation was a favorite. So that was, again, on-prem. Now we're going to take another look at cloud and see the similarities there. We're essentially looking at a particular site, which is what we were just doing. And now on the cloud side of things, we're going to query for the site of Alfresco courses, that particular specific site. And we should see the details of that site returned in the response. All right. So how does that stuff all work? I won't, again, get into too many details here, but a lot of this is annotation driven. It's very easy to add to it and define new endpoints. And so it's driven by these annotations, these interfaces. You're not having to specify free marker to output the JSON or anything. It's using standard POJO serialization through JSON. Gethin came up with this tagline of, you write the Java and we'll handle the rest. And it's really true, as we'll see in another demo here, that it makes it incredibly easy to add to this, this sort of API. And all this is, of course, open source. Source code is available on our standard SVN repository under the Remote API project and within the org Alfresco REST package there. And that link in the slide presentation will take you, I think, directly to that space. So we'll take another look at another demo here. We're going to be using a project, a demonstration project that Gethin put together called QuickRest that uses, again, the Alfresco Maven SDK to add different endpoints to the public API. And one thing to note here is that Gethin had some trouble trying to figure out exactly what would you add to this API in a demo. It's very difficult because there is a whole lot of stuff in there. A lot of thought has gone into what would somebody need out of this API. So again, check the API reference, check the documentation for things that are already in there. Hate for you to waste a lot of time reinventing things that are already present in there. So let's take a look at that demo. So here we're looking at Eclipse and a standard Maven layout for a project. And again, this is building essentially an AMP. And first we're going to take a look at a simple endpoint, adding just a hello world. We're going to send in some text and have it spit back out for us. And one thing to note here is our package info. So here we're starting to define, as we talked about, that namespace of our endpoint. In this case, my company. This is private in its scope instead of the public. And in this case, we're just going to use version 1. And if we look at an actual endpoint, an actual resource, we can see that here we're adding a hello endpoint, as discussed. And we're defining that through this entity resource annotation. And the title is simply descriptive for developers, but the name is what's going into our actual URL endpoint. And then another thing to note is this interface that we've implemented, entity resource action, and the read by in particular for string ID. And that's guaranteeing that we're going to have this read by ID method that is going to return a string. Now the API description, API params, those are again just descriptive items for a developer. They're not needed specifically here. So as you can see, it'll work just fine. Deleting it, and all we've got is a simple read by ID method, passing in a string of hello, and we're returning some other response. And if you didn't catch that, what it returns, it's just hello plus whatever you sent in. So hello everyone, and we'll see a different response there. But obviously we can do some more interesting things than that. If you got paid to develop that, then you're doing very well. So we'll look at a relationship resource for folders in this case. A little bit different than the endpoint we had before. We're in the same package here. We're going to be using the same my company namespace. But again, we're looking at a folder relationship. We have a different annotation here of relationship resource. And in this case, we're dealing with a node entity. So again, that top level entity of sites, people, that sort of thing, we're dealing with nodes here. We declare that with this entity resource of nodes entity resource class. And again, we've got folders as the endpoint for this particular URL call. And again, we are implementing this interface. In this case, we are doing a relationship resource action of read. It's going to return a type of file info for us, or in this case, a collection of file info. And that guarantees us the method of read all, where we're passing in a node ID and other parameters, and then we're getting back a collection of file info. And this collection with paging info just wraps essentially a standard Java collection, but allows for pagination. So looking at that a little closer, what exactly are we passing in there? Where we're going to grab the file folder service from the service registry, and we're going to call list folders on the particular node ref that we've sent in. And we're validating that node ID with this nodes object. And if you look here, we've got an auto wire annotation, so that Spring is going to automatically inject our service registry and this nodes object that helps us with our validation and with some other utility methods there. So this time we're going to take a quick look at CMIS Workbench that I mentioned before. And we're using the browser binding in this case. We load our repositories. So this is what CMIS Workbench browser looks like. You can see a standard kind of listing of the contents of this particular folder. We'll go in the document library for a site, and we've got, this is the sample project, sample site that's included in a out-of-the-box repository. And we're just going to grab the ID for this agency files in this case. And this time we're going to go through just Firefox and standard browser instead of Postman, just to show different development technique here, or development tools rather. And hopefully you all can read all of that, making notes on that as well. Those of you that have ones and zeros coursing through your veins, this is probably just fine. But we're going to go in and I'm going to format that a little bit better, and we're going to filter out some of the items that we want, as we'll see in a second. So we've got our pagination in there. We've got then the actual entries. So this is just a standard developer tool that is navigating a JSON structure. We can take a look at one of those individual entries, and we can see that that's the contracts folder in this case. And you can see listed there, we're not lying, this is Siemens Workbench displaying the same results to us that we got from our direct call. So if we look at one more, we can do some more interesting things and do some filtering here. This time we're going to do a document relationship. We're using the same namespace here. In this case we're going to be using the same relationship resource annotation, but we're going to have a documents endpoint. And we're still using the nodes entity resource. That's still, again, the kind of entity that we're dealing with here. It's nodes. And we're doing, again, read. In this case, we're returning a document or collection of document types. So we're sending in node ID parameters. In this case, we're going to be looking for a parameter called XPath. And if it's null, we're going to use a wildcard of anything. Then we're going to use this search service, grabbing that from the registry. We're going to call select nodes there. And we're going to pass in the parent node ref that we're concerned with and the XPath filter that we want to use there. I promise we will. It's coming. So we're going to go back to Siemens Workbench just to grab another ID. We're looking at the images directory within our site under the agency files. We'll grab that ID, post that in there. And again, our endpoint that we were looking at was documents. And again, if we navigate that structure, we can see that we have 11 in there. And if we look at the individual entries and verify that through Siemens Workbench, we can see there are, in fact, 11. But now we can, again, the point of this was to add that XPath. And in this case, we're going to do something kind of neat. We're going to narrow down by specific metadata. In this case, what we put in is the EXIF manufacturer property. So now we've filtered down to just 2 of these items. Again, by passing in that XPath of the manufacturer, and that's EXIF metadata that's embedded when the device actually takes the picture, embeds that manufacturer information. And we can see we've narrowed that down to just 2 entries in that images folder. Again, that was still our parent. And we can also restrict the metadata that's returned. So in this case, we're saying, just give me the title. I really don't care about anything else. I don't have time to look at all that JSON. Just give me the title, which in this case is all that's returned. And we can verify that if we go to Siemens Workbench, we take a look at this individual item, look at all the properties there. Again, this is the turbine JPEG we're looking at. And if we go towards the bottom, somewhere in there, we will see the EXIF manufacturer is in fact Canon, which was what we sent in our XPath query. Great. So just to sum up, we need to know this high-level architecture. You don't need to know every single detail out there, but you want to be sure that you know enough to not reinvent the wheels. Use amps for on-prem extension for the reasons we talked about. And to get started easily doing those amps, you can use the Alfresco Maven SDK. And if you're building an application that talks to Alfresco 1, either cloud or on-prem, use that public API, of course, which includes CMIS and the REST endpoints that we went through. Obviously, please do attend the other summit talks that go into more detail on some of these issues. And we've got the experts bar available if you have specific questions that you want to corner an engineer or other staff member, and hopefully we can help you with some of those questions. And unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions now, I don't believe. But thank you very much for coming.